Lorenzo, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to present in front of you all today. And so the question of the architectonics of living and of forms of living. So I have to say though, today I will try to do something, let's say, that goes a bit out of to a certain extent of my comfort zone. And like I was invited by Lorenzo in his vest and on behalf, let's say, of the Department of Housing. So I thought, okay, let's try to confront this theme. So forms of living and figures of thought. No? So the topic of this course. So I was thinking, okay, how does this relate, for instance, with these two terms, no? Architecture and the house, architecture and housing, no? That are somehow seem to be quite closely related and sometimes even overlapping, no? So what is their relation? Do they coincide? So the house is somehow, Lorenzo was talking about types, and the house in a way is the archetype, no, of architecture, the quintessence of architecture. So for instance, the temple, no, so this kind of also archetype of architecture is usually understood as the house of the gods. The church is the house of God itself. So the house seems to always be, in a way, a matter of architecture. But is it really so? So this will be my first question. No? And in order to explore this question, I would like to start from one of our first dwellings, so to say, in a philosophical way. So language. So language is let's say, where the human dwells, if you want. No, so where we make our thinking, where we inhabit the thinking, we inhabit it through language. So, and by going through language, thinking about, for instance, the first term, no, architecture. So where does it come from? So the term architecture mostly was introduced, as we know, with Vitruvius. So during the first years of the Roman Empire. So architecture, especially in the way in which we understand it today, as the art of building. No? So as something that has to do with buildings and with building practice, with Baukunst, as you would say here in German-speaking countries. So Vitruvius, the 10 books on architectures. So it speaks about temples, orders, but also it speaks about other things that today we would not that much associate with architecture, which are, for instance, war machines and clocks. No? So this is already something that seems to question, let's say, what are the disciplinary boundary of this profession. But then this meaning, let's say, of architecture as having something to do with buildings is more consolidated, I would say, with, for instance, Palladio's 4 books on architecture. So the topics here are the 5 orders, the best practices in building, private houses, especially in highlights, roads, bridges, squares, porticos, temples. So war machines and clocks are, let's say, not anymore there. So the architecture starts to be closer to what we consider it today to be. And let's say one of the few to challenge this, let's say, linguistic association is perhaps Alberti in his De Re Edificatoria, which translates something like on the matter of building. So the title is not anymore architecture. There are still 10 books like Vitruvius, but again, it's not architecture, but on the matter of building. So architecture is nevertheless there present, but as architectandi rationem, so as a kind of architecting reasoning. So all the three, what is interesting is these three treatises that say, I mean, in a very broad sketch are perhaps one of the most, until now, canonic text or canonic treatise from antiquity in the Western world about architecture, have to treat something which is the orders, no, the Greek orders and so there is a kind of derivation of or origin of architecture from the Greek orders. And this I'm highlighting because, interestingly, the Greek rarely speak of architecture as such, rarely speak of architecture as substantive. So this is the Greek term that, let's say, comes from which architecture, if you want, derives, which is architecton, which is not architecture, but is the architect. So it's a substantive, is not on architecture as an art, but as the one that exercises this art. And Architecton is a chief artificer, master building, the director of works, an architect, of course, an engineer. So it's a kind of constructor or an author, the manager of the State Theater and of the Dionysian, no? So all this kind of cloud. So it's a title that, if you want, extends beyond the range of what Alberti would have called the re edificatoria, the art of building. So this adjective, architectonic, refers instead to a master art or to a master science, but it's not necessarily something that has to do with buildings. And for instance, Aristotle himself in the Nicomachean Ethics says that politics is the highest form of architecture. So politics itself is, if you want, an architectonic art. What is then comes closer in ancient Greek to what today we refer as architecture in the sense of building, of the re edificatoria, is a different term, which is this one. So this is we have the architecton and we have the oikodomos, or oikodomos. I'm sorry with Greek-speaking present people for my pronunciation, but this is a builder, an architect, no? So, and the oikodomos is the builder, the architect that knows how to build a house. So it specifically has to do with a building fabric and the one of the house. So the oikodomos, like architecture, is a composite word. Oikos is the dwelling, the house, and domos comes from the verb demo and refers to the act of building in itself. So oikodomike, or what we could today translate as economics, if you want, is the literally translation of, in Greek, of what, for instance, in German is Wohnbau. So you have oikos, domos, Wohn and Bau, no? The oikodomos is, if you want, the Wohnbauer. And domos is, if you want, still present today in words such as domestic, domotic, that come also from the Latin domus, which is the house in itself. So it's a kind of shift of meaning. Oikos, as you might already know, is present today in terms of such as ecology and economy. So the logos or the nomos of our living environment, the ecumene. And this is interesting because I think, in my understanding, architecture as we think of it today has much more to do with these terms than with architectonics in this kind of broader sense. So it is not really anymore in our let's say, common conception, really a master science on art, but rather something that has to do more with the management of resources, so optimization, something that has to do much more with economics than ever. And let's say, as a kind of miniature of this, I chose this project. I don't know if any of you knows it. No? Okay, this is Mies van der Rohe. It's an office building project, 1923. And Mies van der Rohe writes about this project. He says, the office building is a building of work, of organization, of clarity, of economy. No? So we really see this kind of preponderance and this, let's say, overarching theme of economy and, if you want, of economics in architecture. No? And of course, architecture is not just a matter of economy. No, as you know, Mies van der Rohe is also famous for his cross-section column, which is not just, so it has this kind of fancy chrome coating, which is not really economical in itself, but this is, let's say, one of the enigmas that make Mies a master in the sense of architecture. But still, architecture is still really inscribed in economy in the modern, no? And yeah, this is more of a footnote, but this is Hilbesheimer Großstadt, the Hochhausstadt from Hilbesheimer that somehow is the visualization of what he writes then in his Großstadt architecture, so metropolis architecture, in which housing is at the core. No, so housing is the project of the city. Then there's the idea also of the house almost as a hotel, no, that one could rent and live in and move out without too much resistance. No, so the idea is, and yeah, by the way, as an interesting connection, like you see on the housing is the most of the blocks above, and on the blocks below we have this kind of generic service building that pretty much reminds the project by Mies, no? But so the idea is how to think and how to live in this realm of economy, So where thinking can happen only in terms of management and calculations of costs of resources. So in that sense, if you want, economy and ecology seem to go in hand in hand today. And also this idea of resources, how we manage resources, so where everything seems to be already calculated in advance. And so to paraphrase the question, the question I would have today is how to combine necessity. So how to combine the question of housing with the question of freedom. So something that belongs more to architecture, again, as a master practice. And the master is such because nobody dictates him to what to do. So he has a certain freedom, if you want, no? Yeah, so how to combine necessity and freedom. And the first way I would like to answer to this question today is by turning precisely to the highest form of architecture, as Aristotle was mentioning, which is politics, no? And I would like to do so with an essay from Hannah Arendt. I guess most of you know her, is a German philosopher of Jewish family, born in 1906 and then emigrated to France during World War II and eventually in the US. And she's mostly famous for books such as The Origin of Totalitarianism and The Human Condition. But yeah, what I would like to look at it today is this essay from her, which is titled Introduction into Politics. So, and there is an emphasis on into, so not introduction to politics, but into politics. So as you see already, politics is not just a topic, but it's a topos, is a spatial concept, no? And what let's say, here I would make a very broad sketch. The essay is very rich, and I invite you to read it. It's a very nice read. But I would like to only extract some things that are interesting for me today to discuss about. So one of the points to understand politics, and especially if we understand politics as something whose meaning is freedom, Arendt says we have to turn our gaze to the Greek polis, from which the term politics, by the way, comes from. So here we have a plan of one of the many Greek polis. In that case, is Pyrene, I think. And we have almost like a Nolli plan. No? So we have in dark poché, we have what we would call today the private areas, the housing, so the oikoi. And as a negative of it, we have what we would call today the public areas, no? The agora, the theater, the harbor. And of course, the Greek polis is often represented, and especially Greek society, as, let's say, the origin and the home of democracy, no? So in this kind of political freedom that has no master, but in which every citizen, if you want, is a master. And some of these public areas, so like the agora, the theater, the bouleuterion, were housing the political council, so the boulé, in which citizens decided precisely freely, so without a tyrant or a king, of the states, of the fate of their city-state. So, yeah, as I was saying, today we have a kind of almost an idealization of the Greek democracy, of the origin of the Western notion of freedom and equality, not what we've done in the French Revolution would be translated, let's say, to liberté, égalité, fraternité, no? But the point of Arendt is interesting because she highlights that this is not a kind of equality or freedom as with the one we understand today. So it has nothing to do with justice, for instance. The equality of freedom that we have in Greek polis is, as a name, is called isonomia. So it has to do, again, with the nomos. Like a nomos is equal for everybody. But it does not mean, isonomia does not mean that all men are equal before the law, like we would say today, or that the law is same for all. She says, but merely that all have the same claim to political activity. And so this is something that, like, let's say the difference might not be apparent, but I think it will be clearer further. So the law is not equal for everybody, but all men have the same claim to political activity. And I would say there are three features worth highlighting in this concept of freedom. So firstly, Arendt says, this equality and freedom, this isonomia, is a special concept. So this concept does not apply outside of the walls of the polis. So outside of this, let's say, boundary of these walls, this is not valuable. So it's really spatially located. And secondly, the freedom of politics is not to understood, again, in an absolute sense of freedom, but a liberation from, and in this case, a liberation from necessity. She writes, a necessity is precisely what politics is not. In fact, it begins where the realm of material necessity and physical brute force ends. So in other words, politics needs an architecture that defines its domain, that sets the boundaries or the horizon, if you want, between necessity and freedom. So it needs this kind of architectonic disposition. And how does this work? So the freedom and the equality, so the isonomia that is part of the Greek polities, of the polis, is possible only because this kind of realm of necessity is absorbed by the domain of the household. So by the domain of the oikos and the oikonomia. She writes, this liberation, in contrast to freedom, was an end that could and had to be achieved by certain means. This crucial means was slavery, the brute force by which one man compelled others to relieve him of the cares of daily lives. So the oikos and the oikonomia are a realm of brute force that is absorbed and liberates this kind of empty spaces, if you want, of the theater and of the agora. But it's also not just a brute force. So this is the real, let's say, of slavery, and the let's say in the polis, the one that could access isonomia, so that they could have the same, that could gather in the council were only the adult and male, no? So it was only, and the citizens of the city. So the strangers, women, children, and slaves were all excluded from it. And they were, let's say, the main subjects in this sense of the household. And the household is, of course, is a realm in which the speech is not a free speech, but is a speech in which there is command, if you want, and is a domain of brute force, but is also a domain of security and sustenance. She writes, the household, which a free man could live at will, was not just a place where man was ruled by necessity and coercion, but also the place where the life of every individual, though bound up in that necessity and coercion, was secure, where everything was organized to provide enough of life's necessities. So everybody, if you want, was enslaved to the household, but also secured by it. And this is a concept that if you're interested, for instance, Michel Foucault, another a French philosopher, develops in a book which has become then famous in its term, so The Birth of Biopolitics, in which then it talks about management. So precisely this kind of realm of the oikos as something that expands in contemporary times on a global scale, no? But I will not talk about it today. So there is this equality and political freedom, isonomia, can only be built or erected as a kind of architectonic disposition upon the liberation from the domain of the household and of its rules, so the one of necessity and of economia. And I would like to make a remark here. So the public domain, so this kind of domain of freedom so the political domain is not a social domain here. So the social, so social is also a term that comes also, society comes from, the Latin societas, is a mediation between private interests, so it's fully within the economical domain. This is something which exceeds completely and rises upon the economical domain. The social is a kind of economic contract, if you want. And one of the policies beyond economy. So it's an architectonic kind of contract, a nomos. And the nomos is precisely something that establishes a relation between two incommensurable domains, no? The economical one and the political. Necessity and freedom, housing perhaps, and architecture. This nomos, so the way in which this nomos works will then be exploited also, for instance, by the philosophers, so for instance, by Plato's Academy, as a way instead to not to emancipate from the necessity of the household, but to treat politics as a necessity. So in order to free thinking, let's say, to have a free kind of thinking, politics itself will become a domain of necessity. And so this is, I mentioned it in order to highlight that the terms of the way in which this works are not fixed. So of course, we have oikonomia and isonomia in this case, but this, let's say, the mechanics of these nomos can work also with other terms. And the same thing that in this case was freed. So the domain of politics can be subjugated in order to make some other domain arise. And here, again, I would like to just read a quote from Arendt that exemplifies what I'm saying. So she said, just as a liberation from work and the cares of life was a prerequisite for the freedom of the political man, liberation from politics was a prerequisite for the freedom of the academic. It is in this context that we hear for the first time that politics is a necessity, that politics as a whole is merely a means to a higher end that lies outside of it, that it must therefore be justified in terms of such a defined end. So this is, if you want, the passage to a more also contemporary for understanding of politics, in which you think politics precisely in that way in which Foucault is always already anticipating. So in terms of management, no? So kind of itself as a political economy, as we would say today. Yeah, and this scheme, of course, is not, the terms I was saying are not fixed. Another way in which we can precisely understand the way it can work is this. So free time and business, otium and negotium, so negotiation and leisure are linked to each other also here quite etymologically. So negotium, negotiation is precisely the negation of leisure. So this kind of business, which in Greek then would be translated as skole and askolia. So askolia is the business, and skole, which relates to today's terms such as school, is precisely the emancipation from this economic business. So, but today is also something that I think we do not really conceive in architectonic terms, but more in a kind of, again, everything in kind of social and economic, because for us today, free time is somehow simply the time that one takes away from business. No, they all kind of in the end sum up. No, so also this idea of, for instance, work-life balance it presupposes that we could just calculate everything and make a kind of balance out of it. No? But what this, let's say, this more architectonic understanding suggests that it's not really a matter of calculation, but of architectonic disposition. So there is a mechanics, a disposition of things that make one domain arise out of another, and not simply in negative or in terms of subtraction. And again, this kind of disposition is free to host other kind of terms. And for instance, yeah, one last example on this chapter that I have here is so this kind of same nomos perhaps can be found in further architectural references. For instance, Rossi's Architecture of the City. Now you have this, I don't know if any of you already read it, but if you read it, there's this kind of relationship that Rossi establishes precisely between housing and the so-called urban facts, no? As precisely as what arises out and upon of the mass of housing. So again, this kind of relation, housing architecture, to come back. Good. Yeah, now I would like to shift from, so we discussed it a bit, the idea of living, of politics. I would like to start shifting to the idea of thinking, no? So from let's say from nomos to logos. So thinking also in the way we look at things. So our figures of thoughts today, I would say, are predominantly logical scientific. So after Enlightenment, we have a kind of age of reason in which we often speak of thinking in terms of critical thinking, in terms of judgment, so a determination of causes, of making judgment, of looking for laws and principles that rule our world beyond the tyranny, for instance, of ideologies, of worldviews, of religions, or whatever you name it, no? And one thing that goes hand in hand with this, I think, is also an idea that is quite modern, which is an idea of transparency. You know, there's also today, sometimes, especially when it concerns to, concerning institutions, we have, well, institutions must be transparent, so we can determine things rationally, we can make sound judgment, we can look at how things really happen, no? And this is, again, and a bit, I would like to have an architectural excursus, because this modern myth of transparency is something that is really embodied to a certain extent by a great part of modern architecture. So, for instance, here I put, again, Mies van der Rohe, 1922, the project for a glass skyscraper in Berlin Friedrichstrasse. So this is one of the versions. He had another one. And about this building, Mies writes, the glass skin, the glass walls alone permit the skeleton structure its unambiguous constructive appearance and secure architectonic possibilities. No? So the glass that lets us determine this kind of unambiguous constructive appearance. Concrete, steel, and glass are genuine building elements and the instruments of a new building art. They permit a measure of freedom in spatial composition that we will not relinquish anymore. And only now we can articulate space freely, again, freedom, open it up and connect it to the landscape. Now it becomes clear again what a wall is, what an opening is, what is floor and what is ceiling. So now we can have clarity. Thanks to this transparency, we can look at the elements and we can determine them as they really are, and we can be free. This is, of course, not just me. There's also a bit earlier, 1914, Bruno Taut's glass pavilion that follows Paul Schebert's view on architecture in which all the walls are made of glass. And again, 1911, Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer's Fagus Show Factory. I guess, hopefully you'll be familiar with these examples from your history courses. And then back to a more contemporary examples, again, Mies van der Rohe, Farnsworth House, 1945, 1951, which a project that seems in a way to materialize the revolutionary character invoked by someone like Walter Benjamin in his essays. So here I put a couple of quotes from Walter Benjamin precisely about the idea of a glass house, in which he writes, "To live in a glass house is a revolutionary virtue par excellence." Why? Because objects made of glass have no aura. Glass in general is the enemy of secrets, is also the enemy of possession. So there is this idea that, again, transparency and glass can emancipate us from this kind of this dominion from the opaque, no? And from this dominion, this kind of capitalist dominion of property. So the glass house is somehow the architectural fulfillment, if you want, of the Marxist dream. So no more aura, no more private property. So we know that didn't really go in this way, but this was what Benjamin was writing at the time. So we have, again, an idea of publicness, which is in this sense, again, more, let's say, conflated to the social. So publicness as an immediate expropriation from the private. So not as something that rises upon, but something which is just the removal of the private. And then, of course, this notion of aura, you might know, became more famous in this essay by Benjamin. So the work of art in the time of its technical, or if you want, mechanical reproducibility, depending on translation, in which photography and film, the rise of photography and film makes the work of art a matter of technical reproducibility. So with the aura disappears the cultic value of the work of art. So its religious character, which was a matter, let's say, of enslavement, according to Benjamin. So we are emancipated from this enslavement precisely thanks to technologies such as the one of photography. So art is emancipated from religion and becomes fully a social matter, so a matter of social revolution, all thanks to this machinic character of modern technology, such as photography. And anyone, so the masses, can become an artist as long as they kind of enter in possession of this technology, or as long as they use this technology, you know? And yeah, so what, let's say there is a, if you want, a kind of uncanny precedent of this technical reproducibility in architecture. Now a bit jumping, but so this is Bentham's 1786 Panopticon, the inspection house. And it's interesting that relates in a way and twists in a negative way, if you want, the thing that Benjamin found interesting about photography. So this kind of automatic gaze that works by itself, so it doesn't really need a structure of power, but it's in self as a power in its own, is embodied precisely by this type of the prism invented by Jeremy Bentham's brother, which was an architect. And it's a panopticon. Again, this is a very well-known type in architecture, but I'll briefly explain. So it's a circular kind of prism that works thanks to the fact that all the cells are visible and controllable by one point at the center, which is the point of the guard, so where the guard stands. And not only works, so not only there's like an economization in the terms that we need just one guard, but the way which makes it incredibly effective is also the fact that there is one point, and then each prisoner, thanks to the fact that the guard is somehow hidden inside of the central point, so it has this kind of this curtains that doesn't make him to be seen to the prisoners. The prisoner doesn't really know whether he's there or not, so it kind of functions automatically because the prisoner doesn't know if he's watched or not. So in doubt, he always behaves well. No, so but the point is that there is a kind of automation of mechanization of these gates that penetrates again the surfaces without friction. Also, it's a kind of transparent gates, and in which the observer, so the individual, doesn't really matter anymore. So it is a mechanism that works even if the guard is not there, since the prisoner does not know whether they are observed or not. So it's something that comes closer. So it's also the idea of the inspection house that comes closer again to this kind of more scientific and objective gate. So Michel Foucault again describes the panopticon as a laboratory. So precisely as something where things can be seen in their mechanistic development. Also, they can be determined beyond a kind of individual or ideological or religious, whatever you name it, kind of view. And this is, if you want, also how our figures of thinking affects our form of living. Le Corbusier towards an architecture, 1925. He says, well, like the plane is a machine for flying, the house is a machine for living. Also, this idea of the machine is also something that becomes translated in architecture and in housing. And this is the idea of a maison en série, so a series kind of production of housing. Again, then it's not anymore the work of art as technically reproducible, but the housing in itself, which I find interesting. So of course, now I'm giving you, let's say, a kind of reduction around the points that interest me. So to highlight this idea of economization and how economization has to do with a kind of mechanism, so a kind of determination of things, and that has to do with this machinic character. But of course, the interesting thing of all these architects is that they do not just flatten over this, but that they always articulate and embody these topics in a very interesting way. So yeah, the idea of machines that work economically. So machines are somehow, if you want, the replacement in these terms of the slaves of the oikos, and of architecture as a matter of optimization, almost as engineering. So architecture, a transparent architecture in which there is no friction. So as a machine that turns all the energy into work, no? So that has no kind of expense of energy. So all the energy is turned into work, precisely like our gaze can penetrate completely through a transparent wall. So again, the idea of mise, the building of the office is a building of work, organization, clarity, economy, these kind of keywords. So this is, let's say, a kind of leitmotif that is there. And to a certain extent, I think it still penetrates in our thinking. Yeah, and it has to do precisely with this idea, no? So the kind of idea that we can optimize, and then we can transform all the energy that we have into work, and vice versa. Things can be always convertible in almost a sealed, perfect way. But this is interesting because if we turn, for instance, to physics, in 1803, a physicist called, French physicist called Sadi Carnot notices something funny, that energy cannot really entirely be translated into work. So there is something always which is a residue. There is heat. There is always a dispendium. And this is something that then in a bit later, Rudolf Clausius will coin with a notion which is pretty popular today, but is very, let's say, is often confused, which is interesting, but which is called entropy. I guess many of you already have come into contact with this notion. I will not ask you, normally my classes ask students, do you know what entropy is? But for the sake of the time, I will proceed in showing you a definition from the Britannica Encyclopedia. So entropy, so the measure of a system thermal energy per unit temperature that is unavailable for doing useful work. So entropy has to do with a kind of, so it's already a kind of something that's, starts to mess, if you want, with this idea of an economy in which everything flows perfectly, transparently, without friction. So it's energy that is not converted into work, but dispersed as it. So it's a kind of lazy energy, if you want, no? So it resists to work. And because work is obtained from order molecular motion, the amount of entropy is also a measure of the molecular disorder or randomness of the system. So this is linked also, if you want, there's a kind of shortcuts. Often we speak of entropy as a measure of disorder. This is a bit more complicated. I will not go into depth about this today, but it's not exactly like this. So the concept of entropy provides deep insight into the direction of spontaneous change of our main everyday phenomena. So entropy relates to something spontaneous, so to chance, something which precisely seems to evade determination and predetermination, so precisely seems to evade mechanisms. And its introduction by the German physicist Rudolf Clausius is a highlight of 19th century physics. The idea of entropy provides a mathematical way to encode the intuitive notion of which processes are impossible, even though they would not violate the fundamental law of conservation of energy. For example, a block of ice placed on a hot stove surely melts while the stove grows cooler. Such a process is called irreversible because no slight change will cause the melted water to turn back into ice while the stove grows hotter. So entropy has to do with heat, and it's something that seems to have to do also with time. So it's as one physicist described entropy as one of the very few equations, if not one of the only equations in physics in which the difference of time makes a difference. So the time makes a difference. Also, it kind of provides a directionality. Also, there's always a kind of irreversibility which is there in entropy. And this is one of the equations which we can formalize. So the difference between entropy between two different states of a system is always bigger or equal to zero. So entropy in a system can only increase. And yeah, so this is why I'm mentioning it. So because if taken seriously, so if we take, let's say, this on again on a kind of economic understanding, the implication lead to something very scary. And this is what when it was discovered happened. So Lord Kelvin, that gives the name also to the way we measure temperature in an absolute scale. When he read about this, he started, let's say, to panic. He says, if the universe is a system, and if in a system entropy can only increase, this means that at some point, the energy of the universe will be completely dissipated into heat. So we will have what is called a thermal death of the universe, no? We cannot escape. So the universe will simply die. So we kind of shift from this kind of heaven where we can look at things face to face, so without friction, with its transparency, so without resistance, we move to a kind of hell where universe freezes to death, no? So in this economical understanding of the universe. But this, of course, is not really how things happen. So there is precisely something that counters this death, which is precisely the idea of life, no? So again, with the idea of living, which seems to contradict entropy. And this is something with which we start to understand more, let's say, today, precisely with the advent, if you want, of quantum physics, because quantum physics brings this kind of differential to a whole new level with the principle of uncertainty, no? So this is also an equation in physics that, if you want, celebrates irreversibility, but in a completely different way. So here is the equation says that the multiplication of momentum and position of the electron is non-commutative. So it means, so xp minus px never correspond to 0. There is always a Planck constant as a difference. So there's always something that resists perfect commutativity between this multiplication. So not only there is a difference, if you want, between past, present, and future, as the equation of entropy seems to suggest, but this difference depends upon a decision. So are we measuring first momentum or the momentum or the position of the electron? So if I measure one first, I will lose information about the other. So in a way, so we had with Plato and the Academy, the emancipation of science, if you want, from politics. And here almost there is almost a political character of science. So it is not anymore about necessary determination, but there is a contingency of choice that it is at the base of this kind of physics. So the principle of indeterminacy, you know, that at the bottom of matter, there is not a kind of determined things that we can calculate, but we always have to interfere with them with our decision. So reality and nature are not predetermined, but observation matter. There is an autonomy to the figures, to observation. There is an opacity to observation that comes into play. And this does not mean, for instance, that the subject or the observer determines reality as a kind of a creator, but that observer and observed, subject and object, human and nature, must kind of strike a contract with each other, no? This I will explain further now. So this decision is not completely fictitious, so it's not a kind of fictitious word, but it's formalized always through mathematics, so through a model that is not predetermined or created ex nihilo, but invented. So in that sense, mathematics, if you want, is more a matter of architecture or of architectonics than calculation and economy. So it's a way in which by formulating, by coming up with figures, we can understand and at the same time build the world. And here I throw some of my association with this model, no? So this model has to do with putting in proportion two incommensurable domains. So for instance, momentum and position, for instance, and we can think of it of an analogous, for instance, model in the Roman city of foundation. No? So we often think of this grid as a kind of Cartesian grid. So it's like card and decumanus as two kind of axes of a grid. But the interesting thing is that Cardo and decumanus do not have the same nature. So Cardo has to do with rotation, with the rotation of the sun, and decumanus about partitioning. So again, something that has comes closer to what in quantum physics is momentum and position. And if you want to extend it globally or rather spherically, the idea of parallels and meridians. So, and this is, so what I was saying before, this is not how the world is there. This is not how nature is in the sense of epistemology or ontologies. This is how we write it in order to read it. So it's a kind of contract with nature, no? It's an artificial and natural at the same time. And artificial, not in the sense of fictitious, but as something which is arbitrary, if you want, but still effective, and not effective because it depends on us, but because something else makes it effective. And something, again, that comes close to, again, the Greek nomos as an embodiment of this kind of model. So this kind of contract between incommensurables, so between housing, architecture, or economy, and economia and isonomia. So this is a very, let's say, to give you abstract constellations of how I propose this contract or this model to work. And the interesting thing is, for instance, that through this kind of architectonic or mathematical thinking, one can perhaps rethink not only the economical aspect of housing and architecture, but also, for instance, the ecological one. No? So this is an example. This is a French philosopher called Michel Serres, which writes the natural contract. So it's a kind of new ecology, not one in which nature is precisely not a machine, so a matter of resources to be managed, but in which it becomes almost, nature becomes also a legal persona that has to write a contract. And a contract that precisely differently from Rousseau is not a social contract, but a natural contract. So not a contract in economical terms, so a negotiation, but a contract in which incommensurables are put in proportion and in architectonic proportion to each other. So it is not about the coding whether things are compatible to each other, so if they function or not, but how and in which way things can coexist. So as you see, architecture starts to shift more from management to architectonics, I would say. So from management and judgment to architectonics. And yeah, here I just put an interesting quote that somehow relates to what we were saying with to the Greek city. Michel Serres says, "What is nature? The cities or culture's hell, the place where the banished king was cast out, ban, the city's outskirts, suburbs, banlieue. This exclusion shows that the distinction between two spaces of worldwide and worldly, nature and culture, presupposes a judicial decision." So there's almost this kind of inverted figure. If before we have the public spaces within the city, so inscribed within the oikos, here as if we have nature as this kind of banlieue and periphery, but again, something that is thought through this kind of spatial boundaries, no? That at the same time work through this architectonic model, which is a judicial decision, or something that is neither predetermined by economic needs nor creative, so nor mechanistic nor autarkic. And this is also something which you can find, for instance, in more contemporary theories of architecture. So for instance, Pier Vittorio Aureli, and who has an office which is called Dogma, and he says dogma, why did he call the office dogma? Is because architecture is like a dogma, a decision upon the undecidable. No? So it's kind of a judicial decision that is not a matter of negotiation, but it's something that comes almost as a contract which goes beyond economic. And here I wanted to bring this in because it's also interesting how in all of this, then what arises is the autonomy of the project of architecture. So autonomy, again, not in the sense of autarky, but as something which has its own dimension. And this reading of the contract of what Michel Serres explains in terms of natural contracts in terms of architecture. So the possibility of an absolute architecture is precisely, I would say, goes in this direction. But instead, let's say, of between nature and human, we have here architecture and the city. So he already writes, this book proposes to reconsider architectural form in light of a unitary interpretation of architecture and the city. This unitary interpretation is put forward via the paradox of a unilateral synthesis, a unitary interpretation made from within project and architecture itself. So architecture and the city and a unilateral synthesis. So we can only look at things from one side of the screen if you want. So there is incommensurability between dimensions, this horizon. But at the same time, this synthesis is what addresses the possibility of constituting the idea of the city. So of making the city rise above the mere urban and economical domain. So this is also an interesting declination of that scheme. But the last figure through which I would like to propose to understand this autonomy, so this nomos that does not belong to nothing in particular by itself, so to autonomos, is this one, so the one of the garden. So the garden is an interesting, I would say, architectural artifact. So it's both artificial and natural. It's really hard to tell, to give one assignment to this. And at the same time, if you think of the garden, for instance, in respect precisely to housing, it's precisely something which is both public and private, because it's garden can be the part of the private domain, but it's, let's say, where the part in which the house becomes to a certain extent public, no? And here I chose I always choose as this kind of image of the garden, this project by Office Kerstenger, David Van Severen, which is called Border Crossing. And the garden is precisely an in-between, so a border control between two states in which this threshold is not transparent, but acquires a depth. So there is a friction, a resistance, which is nevertheless a matter of architecture. It's the place where the design of architecture can take place. And again, the one of the garden is a contract, if you want, that cannot be object of a calculation in advance, but that needs to be renewed at every season. So the garden, if you want, blurs the distinction between design and construction. No? So the garden is, yes, of course, you can plan and you build, but then every season it has to be renewed. And it's always precisely a kind of contract with nature, in the sense that it does not depend only on, let's say, human ability, but it always depends on nature if you want to fulfill the project that you planned for this garden. And it's maintenance not just in economical terms, but in the sense of a continuous dealing between artificial and natural. And one way in which I think it's interesting to look at the garden is this book. So today I wanted also to kind of give you many references, so you can pick one or more and just develop it if you like. Which so this is a book which translates in English the inaugural lecture at the Collège de France from Gilles Clément, which is a landscape architect, and it's called Gardens, Landscape, and Nature's Genius, in which Clément introduces these three terms: environment, landscape, and garden. And he says, well, landscape, to begin with, is what lies under the expanse of our gaze. So landscape is what we, as individual bodies, can look at. He says, for the blind, it might be what is within the reach of all the other senses. So it's a sensible kind of image, no? And he says, for one given site, there are as many landscape as there are individual to interpret it. So landscape is something essentially subjective. It's impossible to define it universally. Environment, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of landscape. It is the attempt to give an objective interpretation of our surroundings. So if landscape is individual, if you want, or private, environment goes more public, and it can be shareable. So it's a way. So it's, for instance, is the it says is the acidity or the alkalinity of the soil measured in pH, which is measured in the same way in Europe, Asia, or Africa. The sounds of a site, the radioactive emission. So all this kind of technical data that can be shared. So and then yeah, and it's something shareable in that sense. So if environment is objective and intelligible, landscape is subjective and sensible. So you see, again, there's this kind of two domains that do not talk to each other. So they're incommensurable to each other. And he says, well, what comes then into that is the garden. So this garden precisely escapes this divide. So the garden refers only to environment to set up adequate rules of gardening, and it refers only to landscape insofar as it constantly creates new ones. So the garden somehow transcends this duality of environment and landscape. It is neither one or the other. It is autonomous. So this is the autonomy I was talking about. But at the same time, is not autarkic. So entertains in its autonomy a relationship with both. It sets rules within the environment, and it engenders landscape. And by doing so, though, it affects both. So in landscape, it is not just subjective, but it becomes an object. So it becomes engendered, created, the garden. And at the same time, through the establishment of the rules, the garden relativizes the objectivity of the environment. It accommodates within it a room for subjectivity. So we could perhaps say that the garden has a domain for both subjective objectivity and objective subjectivity. So this kind of double articulation. And again, it's something that is closer to what I was pointing it with quantum physics, or something that weighs together incommensurable, such as, for instance, momentum and position. But it does so explicitly in an architectonic way. So here I come towards my conclusion. I gave you, I know it was a quick constellation. I hope you could follow. But so architecture and housing, architecture and architectonics and economics, how to think of them together. And here I would like to come to, in your TIS description of the course, you have this nice quote by Massimo Cacciari. I will read it again. So it says, dwelling presupposes a defined horizon. One does not inhabit the apeiron, but the limits of dwelling are not rigid boundaries. They are the boundary that necessarily looks beyond itself at the very moment it is marked. Its very design indexes that which exceeds its contact. The place of the home is also that which transgresses its boundary. The place of the house is also always regards the Unheim. The house looks outside. So I hope that you start to read in these quotes some of the topics or the schemes that I was projecting, or the figures that I was projecting today. So dwelling, housing, architecture beyond the economical, the social, the statistically calculable, something that puts incommensurable domains in communication with each other, and that's so in, if you want, an arbitrary way, which means not predetermined, not mechanistic, so in an autonomous way. And as two last, let's say, book recommendations about this. So in the relationship between garden and housing, or architecture and housing, is in this book, it's called On Adam's Housing Paradise. It's interesting, is the relationship between Garden of Eden and a primitive hut, no? So the primitive hut is being used by many architects as a way to justify it, to give a objective ground for their architecture. So they say, since the primitive hut, since the origin of architecture was this and that, then we can say that architecture must follow these rules, no? So in this kind of, again, if you want, to a certain extent, modern scientific understanding of architecture. But this is precisely what Riccardo's book tries not only to question, but to investigate. So to the idea of Adam's Housing Paradise, what he writes in the introduction, he says, a garden without a house is like a carriage without a horse. And yet the scripture, so specific about the onyx found near paradise, says nothing about this implied house, which Rave read into the text. So it says, how come we have a garden of paradise, but this garden does not have a house? How come Adam and Eve were living in a garden, but somehow this house is missing? So the primitive hut is somehow this house that is missing, which is reinvented all the time by architects. And he says, I therefore propose to investigate the arguments of some architects in order to show how the notion of a first house, right, because it was first, was invoked by them as a justification, the first principle of the radical reform. No? So in this, if you want, in this idea of quantum physics, where there is principle indeterminacy, so where there are no objective first principle, there is a space of architecture that can invent the first principle. So in this sense, we go back to the idea of the etymology of architecture in the sense of arche, no? Of first principle, as something which is able to engender its own principles. That can be, so a cause that can be not created nor is predetermined, but that nevertheless can be invented. And in this sense, I was pointing at today as the idea of figures of autonomy, so figures that embody thought precisely as not something autarkic nor creative, but also not transparent, mechanistic, or calculable. So these are architectonic. The other reference that I would like to throw in shifts instead, let's say, architecture as more as a non, if you want, anthropocentric practice. This is The Life of Plants by Emanuele Coccia, in which, precisely this idea of life as something that puts together two different domains, and here precisely the outside and the inside, so more related to this horizon that Cacciari was describing, is not something that not belongs only to human, but for instance, in his reading to plants, because plants, he says, well, we are always used to understand the plants as something that grows from the roots and is determined, if you want, from the roots, also this idea of roots of origin that then determines, and he said, well, no, actually plants live thanks to the fact that they engender their own environment through photosynthesis. So they live in the air, plants rather. So the air is the main element of the plants, and the plants breathe. And breathe is an interesting practice because it says is a rupture of the symmetry between container and container. So it says when there is life, the container is located in the contained, and that is contained by it, and vice versa. So we breathe our own air, so we live in the air, but we internalize the air, and this is also what plants do. So there is a kind of, again, articulation between these two incommensurable domain, and then a way in which, if you want, forms of living and figures of thought in that sense go together as something not just human, but universal. So yeah, this would be, let's say, my, let's say, mood board or my sketch for today. I hope you, you enjoyed it. Economy of microphones.
Yes. So thank you very much, Riccardo. It was a fantastic journey through, I think, things that are on one side a bit out of our, how to say, daily routine way of thinking about architecture on one side. On the other side, I think it was, I like the fact that you referred to a mood board at the end. So in a certain sense, really is an architectonic instrument that we all use also for really profane things. But in that sense, and then please, I always say, but let's consider this moment as a convivial moment. You're really welcome to interrupt. to question things. I think, now I start a bit from my point of view and then, or from my understanding of what you were saying, and let's discuss it a bit. What for me was extremely, how to say, extremely powerful as a proposal that you, or as an answer somehow to my invitation to you, was the sketching starting in a certain sense, literally from what the difference between architecture and autonomous. So really thinking how the practice of housing that we think, as you pointed out really well, as a necessity in a way, which is, I would say, as you also, as the way also that you sketched it. We also know that, for instance, housing is somehow, maybe this is a bit of a personal view, but I would think that this, together with infrastructure, in a certain sense, the two main forces of drawing the city, or the project of the city project goes mainly through infrastructure and housing in a way. And we all know that infrastructure is since 150 to 100 years not really our domain anymore, or it is not fully. Which then gives to housing an extremely important role, no? Which is on one side the one of course, housing life, I would say. And on the other side, to be in a certain sense the biggest action that an architect can do towards the project of the city. Maybe this is also why, for instance, dogma that you were referring to are extremely, let's say, attentive to housing. No? I think that 80% of their project, maybe even more, it's actually housing. So in a sense that that housing, yes, and also here in Vienna, we must know it better than us. In Vienna also there is not only Vienna, but I think Vienna, of course, it becomes a certain kind of really well-tempered example of how housing can draw or can think the project of the city. But interestingly enough, you kind of install this positive-negative relationship. And also from, in a certain sense, what is necessity, what is necessary actually, cannot build in a way the public environment, or actually cannot really think about it. And the way we can think about the public space, or the space of the politics actually, it is actually a negation of housing in a certain sense. So I think it's for us in this course of thinking about types of housing, it becomes really interesting when we think about public space in a way as the negation of housing. And we also have beautiful examples, for instance, I don't know, probably not, but if you know this Danish architect, Kai Fisker, who is really one of the heroes of housing in Denmark in the modern time. His ideas of this super block, I really suggest you to go to Copenhagen to look at these prototypes. The idea of the super block of Kai Fisker becomes in a certain way the negation of itself, no? Because the housing reduces itself to a really thin kind of ribbon. And the center, so let's say what we can even call the garden in a certain sense, or the internal, the interior garden of the housing becomes again a public space. So it's a fantastic experience that you can do in Copenhagen. You cross Fisker's blocks, and actually the city in a certain sense never stops. But in a certain way, there are only, I would say, thresholds of behavior more than thresholds of privacy and publicness. And then you came to this idea of the isonomia. So in the architectonic relationship between isonomia and economia, so autonomy, actually economics. Then you were really rich in bringing us around the transparency, entropy, and then until the moment of the relationship between the capital and the commands, so in a certain sense, between the sun and the partition spectrum. Maybe my first question to start the discussion in a way would be, how would you name? Sorry, or how could you name in a certain sense a kind of transcendental type that this idea of negativity, or the sense that housing can work publicly only if it is negated by the action of the politics in a certain sense. No? That you also brought with, let's say, the difference between the public and the social, which is something that I think today we confuse a lot. And for that, I'm really grateful that you brought, let's say, this difference on the table. But yes, what I'm wondering is, are there, or maybe there are certain types, no? It comes to, you also referred to it, it comes to my mind, the portico could be, in a certain sense, a kind of an architectonic type that is able to in a certain sense, crystallize this negation. But yeah, I will leave it to you. So my question would be, how could you, which kind of types could you name that comes to your mind as architectonic kind of crystallization of this non-negotiation actually, but a really contract in a way between housing and publicness, but also as well between culture and nature, and so on.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if I could positively name types. I think in that sense, I'm not really a Platonist in the sense that I don't believe there are these types, but I think one could. So this is also the interesting thing of the architectural project and the architectural project of housing. So to pose the question, how can housing be not just an economic matter or a social matter? And this is, for instance, yeah, you were mentioning, again, Dogma has research on this, on housing precisely. So how to absorb, so how to enact this scheme of the economy within the house. So with this, there are some projects where there is this kind of serving wall, no, almost a la Can, or in which the wall absorbs all the economic functions, and then the space of living, which is interesting, no? So we call the living room, no? So it's so in that sense, you have the bedroom, which is in their terms like the space of reproduction, so of labor, of work, and then the living room then becomes this kind of, if you want, almost ethical, political space. So how to formalize this in architecture? So this is, I think, is something that I'm not sure I would associate with the type. I'm a bit reluctant to do with that, but it's embodied not in the type, but in the project itself of architecture. And you were mentioning Vienna. I think Vienna is a great example of how this can be done, not just in the past. By the way, there will be, I think, soon a lecture by Aurelian on the Red Vienna, let's say. So precisely how the political is not just the social. So it's not just a matter of negotiation with stakeholders, but to say, no, I am the realm of decision, and I say, okay, I own these houses, and the economical does not interfere here. And to that regard, this is more anecdotic, but I always find it funny. There's an interview from the BBC at some point in London, as you might know. They have a big housing crisis because there is this kind of a neoliberalist economy. Everything is a matter of economics. So there is a big housing crisis, and then they went around, the BBC went around to look for let's say types that might be helpful for solve them. And one of them was Vienna, and then they interviewed one of the chiefs of the Vienna municipal housing projects. And they asked her about, I don't remember the name of this building that has swimming pools on the roof. But yeah, you might all know it. It's a bit outside of Vienna. It's I think a Gemeindebauen, and it has swimming pools on the top. And then they were saying, but well, if you reason in economic terms, why do you need swimming pools? Why can you just take the money from the swimming pools and use it to build more housing? No, so in this kind of thinking, and the lady from Vienna was telling her, yeah, but we want buildings in which people would like to move, not just have this kind of stigma or social. So this kind of, I think, also is an anecdote that shows how this, let's say, political thinking can be fostered, no, beyond this. And yeah, and I think the housing is not just so. The economic, the oikos is the space of this kind of brute necessity, but the housing can be architecture if it manages to articulate this dichotomy within itself. So not just be the place of let's say of needs, but also be a place where, for instance, the garden is in that sense an archetype of of this kind of ambiguity, no? So of this, and it's interesting if you want the garden is normally is around the house, or is this kind of, but if you think, for instance, in the Roman domus, the garden is within, so it has this kind of also possibility, no? This is a kind of interior facade of the house, which is precisely, and then not only welcomes, is public because it welcomes, let's say, guests from the house, but it welcomes also the elements of nature, no? So there's the pluvium where the rain comes, so it's almost the house becomes again more like a clock, if you want to go back to Vitruvius as architecture, as something which is not buildings but also clocks and war machines. And relating, yeah, perhaps this is a bit going a bit far, but you were mentioning infrastructure, which is an interesting term because infrastructure is this, what is in between structure, and there is a whole philosophical tradition that understands thinking precisely as something which has to do with the infra. So this freedom is to be thought in the infra, and today we think of infrastructure precisely as serving. So there is always, I would say, we can find architecture everywhere. In that sense, everything is architecture.
Questions, remarks, disagreements, agreements, everything is allowed. Okay, if you're still processing, maybe I can actually, by the way, the project in Vienna that you were referring to is Alterla, which is, yeah, I agree, it's probably the most, at least from the 60s, I would say, not going back to the Red Vienna, which by the way is 100 years old, so in a certain sense became almost archaeological in its way. But yeah, Altera is for sure a fantastic example in that sense, with the pools and the gardens, and of course, in a certain sense, with an idea of yeah, that is of its time, of these mega structures in a way. But at the same time, I agree that it's an anti-economical way of living in a way, or not anti-economical, but something that can accommodate also not only an-economical thinking. I want to jump to the really last moment of your presentation, or your lecture actually, because you made me. I mean, the question of the primitive hut, I guess that most of you are aware of it now. For instance, it's this really famous image from Loge Treatise, in which there is this kind of idealization, which I mean, that I understand your concerns with types. I mean, the question of types is, of course, a question, a difficult one, because it's types, the way we can think about them is something. I mean, of course, in a way, they are the most idealized kind of visualization, even, or conceptualization of a relationship between living and forms, I would say, or so what generates a spatial experience of a project. So actually, yeah, after almost half of the semester, I agree with you. I'm becoming more and more concerned with types, but at the same time, then going more and more towards the idea of models in that sense. So actually, with a certain kind of coexistence between types, models, and system, in a way, or the way types are, in a certain sense, always restructured by models, or if types, actually there is a certain kind of incompatibility between types and models, but this is going to be for next lectures, not today. But so interestingly, I really appreciated and I liked it a lot, the way of your ending. You know, when you say actually the primitive hut, how come is it possible that, that Adam and Eve, they did have a garden, but they did not have a house? So what is the question of housing when, let's say, metaphorically, of course, the two first human beings, they did not have a house, no? And then how can architects, as they did, since Roger took this on with this famous image that I was referring to, how can we then think that there is this primitive hut is somehow the archetype par excellence, no? So, by the way, there is a really interesting number of Sarocco, I think it's number 8, it's precisely about the title is Whatever Happened or What's Wrong actually with the primitive hut. And I think that there are many things that are wrong with the primitive hut. And as you were referring, the fact that with the primitive hut, we kind of, we architects, but not only, we kind of refer always to some kind of a golden origin, no? And then, in a certain sense, the activity of the architect, in a way, should be the one of kind of bringing it back or representing it, which is probably even worse. But I think you kind of made me, I mean, I was really daydreaming when you were presenting this absence of the primitive hut and the idea that since if the two first human beings, they do not have a house, the primitive hut is an absence of itself. No? So actually, in a way, yeah, each architect, as you were suggesting, works in order to rethink about or to repropose kind of an articulation or a spatialization or a formalization of this primitive hut, which then makes a lot of sense when, if we think at least about, but not only, about modern architecture, but not only, the house was, and probably still is today, the project through which architects were, in a certain sense, able, for many different reasons, to better, on one side, think, and on the other side, formalize their idea of the universe. No? So, in that sense, the house, also, if you think about Corbusier, Mies, Kahn, Wright, of course, it built more than 200 houses. But not only if you think about a really nice book by Eisenman that is called Ten Canonical Buildings, mainly houses, not only. The book is about houses, but when Eisenman writes about the struggle that Mies had differently from Corbusier, he said, well, basically Corbusier found his type, or we say his model, in 1916 with the idea of the Renaissance economy. So this idea of the domino system became the model through which Corbusier actually, from the end of from the beginning of the 20s to the 60s, kind of always conceptualized and thought this project, even if of course there are some concerns about at least the last period. And then it's a Mies, in a certain sense, had to wait until the Fensworth house. It's the Fensworth house. Before the Fensworth house, Mies didn't have, in a certain sense, a model of the universe. No? So he didn't have yet rebuilt his own primitive hut following the proposal. And then I suggested to read this passage. It's really nice when he speaks or he writes about the fact that Mies brings out the structure and then in that sense is able to free the interior space of the Fensworth house. But so in a certain sense, I mean, these were just two examples, but also if you think about Valerio Giotti's Villa Len, in a way that is really recent as an example, is, I think, another kind of formalization and construction in a way of the primitive hut. So in that sense, I was also, because of the Fritz Haller Lobsteller house, I think there are, in this absence of the primitive hut, a really beautiful and powerful way of thinking about somehow the architect way of working. And also always thinking again this idea of the primitive hut and formalizing it. Maybe one thing that I would also like to ask you in that sense. I mean, it's probably a question for which there are no answers. When the primitive hut becomes collective, no? Which is a bit, I think, the difficult thing about housing, in a sense, because when the primitive hut stays fully private, which is private at least in the sense of the client, which is the house, there is a certain kind of probably certain kind of actness, no? that is able, in a certain sense, to make the idea of the reconstruction of the primitive hut coming back again. But in a certain sense, when the primitive hut becomes collective, so when it's not the project of a house, but it's the project of collective housing, probably there, as you were proposing, there is a certain kind of full transparency. Also, in a certain sense, there is this fully economical model that drives it. So in a certain sense, would you say that the fully economical model in a certain sense, or housing as we tend to think it usually, obstruct or kind of counter, it's a force that goes against the possibility of rethinking the primitive path.
Mm-hmm. So no, I would say no. And I would say actually that collective housing and the idea of thinking, for instance, of housing in series or of housing for multiplicities or for masses is again something which is an opportunity that has been taken by the modern architect as an opportunity to think precisely in that sense, not just housing as architecture, but also architecture beyond housing and beyond building. And a few years ago, I wrote this essay for Oase about precisely Hilberseimer. It was comparing Hilberseimer and Frank Lloyd Wright, which are like apparently are two. They could be like as far as each other, but both of them. What was interesting is precisely they were addressing the idea of how can, through architecture and through housing, think of the idea of a citizen. So how can we think of this collectiveness, not just in a mere, let's say, cell or individual sense, but how can we think of the citizen through architecture? So in one case, the answer was this kind of house as a hotel, so Hilberseimer, so it was almost, it's always on the verge if it's really kind of a project of reality or so. But yeah, so this idea of a more so how to find still the idea of housing in this very strict economical condition, and the other one was the idea of Usonian, also the new land, of this kind of a more agrarian economy, but which could still host a certain culture and precisely be in dealing with these forces of nature that were not the most domesticated. You know, the falling water house is not collective housing, but it is explicit at this. And then the idea of how can we build houses for this new collectiveness, which is the American one. So I think also there is always an opportunity. So in that sense, I would say, so what I was quoting, what I was mentioning with the natural contract, which is not about whether things fit or not, but how things fit together. So this is the architectonic question. So precisely then it goes, let's say, from a more, if you want, scientific, but in the sense of ontological, epistemological to architectonic. And I think this is precisely what also science today discovers with quantum physics. So the idea that there is principle indeterminacy, which corresponds to this void of the house, in my understanding, in the Garden of Eden. Also, there is the void of the house, which means we can invent this house, and architecture can invent this house all the time, and not completely free, but in this kind of liberation, in this kind of mathematical gesture. So I think this is always the opportunity of architecture. And again, so something to follow on your interest for the primitive hut, I think, so this is precisely with where I was interested today to go with this kind of oscillation between science and architecture. So this is where architecture, so for instance with Loger and this kind of practices, tries to be scientific, and they say at the origin was this, therefore we can determine that. But it is of course an invention. Also, it's a literary invention, and this is, I would say, where architecture dresses up as science, and this perhaps could relate to your interest in the habito scientifico, no? So as also a fashioning of itself as science. And this is connected to then what you were saying about the universe. So there is a connection between cosmos and cosmesis. So the way in which we access the universe and we understand the universe is not unrelated from the way we dress it up. So in that sense, is architectonic. So in the way in which we have we do cosmetics in that sense. No, so cosmetics is not just this kind of superficial practice, but becomes then something which is fundamental in the way we understand things. And this goes hand in hand with the question on the type. So the type is something that architecture also used in a way as the primitive act to say this is the scientific way, the type is a kind of classification, but we can rethink the type precisely through the notion of the model as something in which let's say impression and expression go together but yeah, I don't want to go too far with that. But so yeah, I think in that sense, so this is also the beauty of architecture, that it keeps on opening. So it's this kind of emancipation gesture, which is not an emancipation in negative, so in a kind of subtraction or in a calculation, but it always rises upon. So it's always create space that somehow was not there before, or you didn't, according to calculation, let's say, was not there. No? So, yeah.
Thank you for the answer. I mean, especially the part of impression expression.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was extremely rich, extremely deep, and at the same time able to open many thinking or many ways of thinking about what we are doing here in the class. So do you have questions? Otherwise, yes, yeah, oh, a lot. Happy.
Well, more than a question, like, I want to thank you for the lecture because, like, last week, no, the past 2 weeks, we had a lecture and the speaker talked about the Villaggio Matteotti, Zeni, and like these lectures of yours, it's, in my opinion, I think it's really like explains well, like what happened when you try to like build as you said, some sort of collective act. And like the houses became like the boundaries of the garden, and itself it's a dogma. And also the types build some sort of ambiguity, no? And the Carlo is the genius because in itself bring also the infrastructure to the houses. So amazing. I really like all the lectures, especially also like these talks now. Like Villaggio Matteotti was there all the time. Like as a I don't know how to say, at least to me, as a specific example of what we are talking about also autonomy and all these things. So yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a specific question, but rather like I don't know, some sort of comment, because like Villaggio Matteotti was possible due to the political will, like participation in its premises, you know. So I think really like all the first part of your lectures about, let's say, the premises of then a search for how to connect, a search for the in-betweens of domains. I think was really useful and clear. So thank you.
I haven't really formulated my question right now, but I'm more interested in like this role of architecture in democracy, and because you explained it very nicely, it's like how you as like a system of scholarly relatives happenings, and I feel like nowadays we are not even that participating by things anymore, like the way of thinking, like especially in this political form. I feel like there's a lot of excluding parties, let's say, and a lot of people are not aware of the way of thinking that we do now, and how we can bring that more back into public space as our role of chemists.
Yeah, but thanks for your question. I'm somehow connected, but yeah, perhaps I will start from the last one. Yeah, I think this is, let's say, I don't know. Yeah, this goes in the direction in which architecture stops being merely about buildings and can be about something beyond this Baukunst. And yeah, something, let's say, which Aristotle would have agreed on, politics as the highest form of architecture. And so I emphasize politics not as political economy. So I think this is a bit, if you want, to a certain extent, one of our troubles today. So to reduce politics to economics or to political economy makes it so that then democracy, the way we understand democracy, is precise in these terms of if you want, mere calculation, no? So where like everybody can cast his vote, we can count, and then it's merely operative. So it just works by itself. So there's no representativeness in itself. But the interesting thing, for instance, is that our democracies, for instance, now in Europe, is that they're representative democracies. So they include a process which is not just a matter of calculation. You vote someone that then represents you and is meant to bring your concerns to parliament, but also it is a person, it's not a machine, so it has its own thinking, so it just not interprets your let's say concerns, but it also needs to decide whether your concerns are valid or not, and yet being your representative. So I think this is where also let's say the architectonic character of politics can be investigated, and so yeah, I think this is a bit, let's say, a challenge, not just as architects, but as citizens today. So how can we, how can we reinvent our institutions so that they can work not just in this operative way? So how can we reinvent the architecture itself of things? Also, for instance, one of the most recent projects in that sense has been perhaps the project of the European Union, no? So, and then there are problems with it. And this is, but let's say I don't want to go too much. I'm not a political scientist in that sense, but this is not an excuse. No? So this, as architects, we can, I think, have a say also on this. And for instance, again, with the European Union, which is interesting, is precisely the architectural, not just the architectonic, but the architectural aspect. No? So we have a kind of super state, if you want, that almost has no architectural face. No? So what you think of, I don't know, of the Austrian parliament, there is this kind of Greek temple. If you think of the Italian parliament, is the buildings of the Quirinale. So they all have this kind of face, but Europe has kind of no face. So what does this matter? So is this a gas again in this kind of transparency? So how can we think of it? No. So this is also not just an architectonic, I would say, but also architectural concern. And by the way, again, there's a book by Aureli and by Dogma on, it's called Brussels, a manifesto, in which so architects try to rethink the architecture of this institution and how to make it tangible in architectural terms. So this could be interesting. So yeah, I don't have like, let's say, a ready-made question on how to solve the problems of democracy today, but I think there's also an opportunity as architects. Coming back instead to the Villaggio Matteotti, yeah, it's funny because if I had to think of a type today, I would have never thought about Villaggio Matteotti, but it's interesting you mention it because this was one, when I was doing my master's in Milan, this was one of my very first obsessions, the Carlo Matteotti, and it was precisely a kind of social obsession of saying like, enough with the archistars that kind of drop down the thing, and let's look at people that do things bottom up. And the Carlo, I agree, is a great example. It's very, because precisely it not only investigates this kind of bottom up, but it does so also trying to break and to be critical to the ideologies that might arise out of there. So I think, especially today, this also, for instance, in Milan, there is some people that claim to be followers of the Carlo and be involved in this participation bottom up and use participation precisely in its opposite direction, to say, to give a kind of, if you want, in Italian we would say contentino, so to give a kind of, let's say, sorry? Yeah, to manipulate the people. So, but this, to say, so the Carlo, what I thought was interesting is that, so if you read his text, he was critical with himself about participation and its limits. So he was exploring, say, okay, how can we involve the people that will live in these houses in the project of their own houses? But it was not just going and say, draw your own house and then I will build, no? So he was still claiming the role of the architect. He was saying, I will tell you how the house looks like, but let's find a room and a role. So in that sense, goes back to the idea of representation, of democratic representation, for you to be part of the process in a way which is not just, I deliver the house and you enter and leave it as someone that buys a product, no, in a kind of commercial sense. So in that sense, yeah, he was trying to find the role of architecture within, and I would say against the social in that sense. So, and this was, I think, was interesting. At the end, I think, of this career, he was, if I'm not mistaken, it was a bit disillusioned with that, because this, let's say, this participation was not working as much as he wanted. And then, of course, then it got a bit turned against itself. But his reflection were very interesting. And for instance, there are very interesting articles and dialogues and letters between him and Ernesto Rattan Rogers, which was belonging, let's say, to a more kind of intellectual or scientific kind of role of the architect that instead knows what good architecture is, and so it's kind of more elitist. But both of them are very, it's interesting to find, to look at these two positions of that respect each other, but kind of fight in a very political and intellectual way. Yeah. Okay, so maybe there's like someone there, someone can.
Where? Yeah. Maybe just when I walk up there, I think a class works well when we speak about participation, and we do not speak about Alameda, but we speak about the capital. That means we're doing great.
Hi, thank you. So I'm trying to propose a question that tries to be specific, and I was wondering, you were talking about as I understood your lecture, that the new dogma of architecture is economics in a way, and how to free from that. And the examples we are right now looking at that are trying to work within this system, but still trying to formulate new questions and articulate something, a new way of how to work within the system. Say, maybe this habitat, where you would do a specific verein and collect money from different people, so you can buy a house, a dwelling, and keep it from economics. And I was wondering if this is always working within the system, and I was wondering, because we're talking so much about freeing from the system, and going away from, I don't know, liberating and something like that. So I was wondering, what exactly you want to free from, and how do you, I don't know.
Can we also collect the second question, maybe?
I just wanted to ask if you make this connection from participation, democracy. How could we think of types of the models on truly democratic spaces, especially like parliaments, or when you are in Brussels in the European Quarter, the Bellamont building, and there's this also isn't there. It's quite funny because there was this connection in your lecture between glass and steel structures, which now formulate more or less the whole European Quarter in Brussels, and this is a place of institutions that claim to be democratic and involving, and then you are there and you have more transparency in it. And so what people really because I was thinking about, it was quick, but about things like a store, as it just as a space of a store, and with Chronicle, it has maybe a potential if it's just adaptable structure. But when does adaptable structure became problematic, because this can be also led to the use of let's say actions like fascism or something. Structure can be always beautiful and adaptable. So you understand?
Yeah, you mentioned the store as a structure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ah, the store, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll start perhaps from the question about freedom and liberation. So, one thing that I would like to highlight is that this freedom of liberation that I was mentioning and that Aaron talks about does not mean that once we free from the household does not exist. So it's not a freedom of liberation as we understand it today as something which a bit, in a sense of a utopia, no? That we free from something else and then it stops existing. We just abandon it. So the architectonic gesture and then the complication, if you want, or the difficulty or and the challenge of architectonic gesture is to say, how can we dispose things so that we can liberate from them, but they should be there. So the houses must be there. So the oikos must be there. And so how can we dispose the thing in the way which this liberation happens, but the things are still there. So we have to live with this thing. And then is how these things fit together. And also again, this idea between, it's not about whether things fit or not, but how do things fit together. So it's about putting things into proportion and how can we fit things together in a way that we find acceptable, for instance. No, and then in this sense, these are the also the interest in the projects we were mentioning. So not only Riccardo, but Dogma, etc. So how, for instance, in the projects of Dogma, there's all these projects about living and working. No, so this idea that now we have, for instance, we work from home. No, so we have, which can be a quite violent idea. No, so our place of our home is invaded again precisely by this economical force of work. Okay, we cannot just say, okay, work does not exist or we revolt against it. No, we have to accommodate. But then how to accommodate these things in a way that that we find acceptable and that makes sense. So how do we make sense of this? So in that sense, how do we build types? So how do we invent types that are making, not only making it acceptable to us, but they're also in that sense making these things appear and tangible. No, so that's also what I was pointing with all these examples from the modern movements about glass. It's not just that they simply accept this kind of domain of economy. They say, okay, how can we, now that we shift from a more, let's say, traditional, if you want, in Benjamin's term, auratic, cultural, ornamental kind of architecture to a more society of mass production, how does this can be shaped in architecture in a way which is still, if you want, beautiful, not to the question of beauty, or how can we, in a way which is tangible, and then we can somehow learn how to manage or how to build as people. And this perhaps connects to the second question about democracy and transparency. I would be very careful to make the equation democracy equals transparency. So it's not exactly like that, but the way in which, so in democracy lies, of course, on the fact that we as citizens take somehow part in the decision and are informed. So let's say now it's not anymore like this, but in a bit in the past, for instance, journalism was called I think the fourth power or the fifth power. So because journalism was important to inform the citizens so that they could make a reasonable vote. But this, I think, more than journalism, what is important to, if you want, achieve this kind of transparency, but at least to navigate this friction, is education. So how can we be equipped with instruments that can help us navigate and understand these things? And this is, let's say, also in that sense, connected to what I was saying before about architecture, in the sense that architecture, let's say, has a way to not only make things visible, but to make it so that we can build our own reality, not again in an absolute sense as a kind of creators, but as inventors. So it's always in this kind of negotiation with some kind of other, call it nature, call it necessity, call it chance, call it God, that we have to draw a boundary with. but this boundary, yeah, is autonomous, and it's mathematical in the sense, again, which is mathematical. Today, when we think of mathematics, we often think about calculation, but I would say, is mathematics beyond calculation. So in a way which is effective independently from us, but it's not univocal. So it can be written in many ways. So in that sense, architecture and mathematics come close to each other. And the meaning of mathematics, if you want, again, going with the Greek etymology, means mathematics is, mathemata is what pertains to learning. So it's about, again, learning, education. So about, let's say, forming within ourselves a kind of architecture that makes us deal with what is there outside. So to make, let's say, ourselves proportionate with the outside. So in that sense, the horizon is the boundary, is the one of our own bodies and our own minds. Other question? Just so for all, also for the ones who ask questions, but I just have a recommendation. So I just put two references of mine. Sorry for the self-reference, but so one is my PhD thesis, which is upon entropy. So this is, let's say, more towards the philosophical side, like the knowledge of information. So I would say, yeah, this is more philosophical. The other one is a lecture from which I draw a bit today, especially the part on the modern and transparency that I did for Innsbruck, the Architectural Theory Institute in Innsbruck, which is called Modernity and the Bureau, in which I go through modern architecture, kind of investigating this myth of transparency. So it's more architectural. So in general, I would say, if you're more in this lecture, you more appreciate the architectural side, go. You could look into that. If you were more like, okay, I want more philosophical content, is more the book, which will be soon available for free online. So just a thing. Yeah.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Maybe just one thing about transparency in architecture. It's interesting about Gropius before the House Factory. And Gropius, who I don't know why, we never studied in a way. I mean, we always studied, yes, he made these industries in 1911, 1914, and then he was writing somehow about modernity and transparency and so on. But actually, Gropius was the German modern architect, actually the one that made able German modernity to in a certain sense, to flourish. To flourish, we also know this. That doesn't matter with architecture. What happened after the 20s in Germany? But the interesting thing is that Gropius has this text that is precisely kind of comparison between transparency and education, and the way he was kind of thinking transparency in schools. Gropius is the first, or actually was the first, let's say, dean of the Bauhaus. So there is a certain projectuality, of course, in the idea of transparency and education, at least in Gropius terms, which I think, I mean, I agree with your critique. It's to be taken really critically in a way. Yeah, because otherwise we have a certain kind of equation that the transparency equals correctness in a certain way, but it equals also control. So yeah. And then that's why then it became, in a certain sense, also what it became. But anyway, I'm really thankful for the lecture and the time that you gave us today and for the discussion. I think it was really inspiring and really deep. So yeah, I hope we see each other around soon. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So soon che adesso.
Esatto. Grazie. De nada, pleasure.